And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Some forms of fatigue are not physical, they are moral, atmospheric, a tension held behind the eyes in the quiet decision to turn away. Not out of carelessness, but from care extended past its threshold. There is a kind of silence that follows the image unclicked, the footage bypassed, the story left unread. It carries the weight of attention withheld, and the deeper ache of not knowing whether that restraint was a failure or a form of survival. This is not indifference. It is something more complex, more difficult to speak of, and perhaps more human. What follows is an attempt to sit inside that complexity without flinching. You closed the tab, skipped the footage, turned your head, not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much. The image waited, but the hand moved. The headline read like a wound, and still the gaze slipped past. Not out of malice, not from apathy, from something quieter, harder to name. The act was small, a gesture of retreat, but it carried weight, a ripple, a question. Not asked aloud, not confessed, a moment of moral interruption, like missing a step. But on the inside, there was no script for this kind of turning away, no language for the tension between what was seen and what was not born, between caring and being unable to care anymore. There is a kind of guilt that lives beneath the surface of this decision, not the sharp sting of wrongdoing, but the soft ache of something misaligned, the sense that some unseen responsibility was not met. That attention, once given, cannot be withdrawn without cost. That to turn away is to unsee, and to unsee is to undo, but this framing is too clean. There is more at work. Exhaustion is not the absence of ethics. Sometimes it is the very reason ethics must shift. The body cannot witness endlessly. The mind cannot hold everything. There are limits, and those limits speak even when unacknowledged. The turning away is not silence. It is the language of survival, spoken in reverse. Still, the question remains, and it hums beneath the moment. What was missed? What was owed? What precisely was laid down in that act of refusal? And who carries it now? The gaze turned away, but the weight did not vanish. It lingers, it asks, and it waits. The weight of witnessing has never been evenly distributed. In some eras, the act of looking was considered an obligation, in others a privilege. But in our time, it has become a constant, inescapable, ambient, embedded in every scroll and stream. The demand is quiet, but relentless. See everything. This demand has a lineage. It draws from the grainy documentation of liberation camps, where survivors stood before the lens not just as evidence, but as a moral summons. Their presence became a contract. If this is seen, it must not be forgotten. Later, television brought Vietnam into living rooms, breaking the barrier between foreign war and domestic dinner. The image became the battleground, and witnessing a form of resistance. But repetition alters substance. Susan Sontag warned of this, that the more one sees, the less one feels. The image, instead of awakening conscience, can dull it. John Berger understood too. The shock of recognition is rare. Most images pass through the eye like light through glass. No friction, no residue. Still, the moral script lingers. To look is to care. But that script ignores the saturation point. It forgets the accumulation. It does not account for the emotional sediment that forms when every act of looking becomes a wound. This is not voyeurism, this is overload. And overload has its own consequences. Yet even here, not all witnessing is equal. Some live in constant exposure. For them, there is no option to look away, because they are always being looked at. Others at a distance are invited into the role of observer with the illusion of safety. But safety is unstable, and the ethics of attention, once assumed, now falter. The question is no longer whether to see. The question is what it means to see too much, and what kind of self is formed or fractured in that process. There is a point at which the act of looking becomes untenable, not because the images have changed, but because something inside the observer begins to splinter. The eye still functions, the screen still glows, but the self recoils, not out of refusal, out of need. This is not disengagement, it is a form of preservation, the slow retreat of inner capacity, not moral collapse, but fatigue reaching its threshold. The scroll becomes a wound reopened by repetition. The footage plays, but no new understanding emerges. only accumulation, only weight. Compassion fatigue is not apathy, it is empathy without resource. The nervous system grows saturated, the spirit thins. There is no space left for metabolizing more pain, so the body chooses a kind of dimming, not to betray the world, but to stay within it. Powerlessness amplifies this need. When the watched event feels immutable, when the pattern repeats without rupture, witnessing becomes a loop. The gaze finds no exit. There is no act to follow the awareness, no transformation to anchor the attention, and so the gaze folds inward, not to escape but to survive. This folding is not failure, it is a signal, one that speaks of limits, one that insists on the necessity of pause, not as retreat but as an act of moral triage. When the entire field is burning, choosing which flame to face is not cowardice, it is a kind of discernment, a cruel, quiet wisdom. Yet even in this pause, the guilt flickers, the knowledge that something seen was set down, that the act of looking away, though necessary, does not dissolve the moral thread, only suspends it. And in that suspension, a deeper question begins to take shape. How do we name the space between refusal and return, between numbness and grief, between care and the capacity to hold it? Responsibility does not disappear when the gaze averts, it only changes form. It moves from the act of seeing to the act of reckoning. If attention is a kind of presence, what remains when presence recedes? The moral architecture many inherit insists that to care is to endure, to witness continuously, to never turn away. But endurance is not infinite, and when it is treated as such, responsibility becomes distorted, confused with martyrdom, drained of its nuance. What is left is not ethics, but exhaustion in ethical costume. There is a difference between abandonment and pause, between detachment and deferred return, but these distinctions are rarely taught and almost never honoured. Instead, the language of duty crowds out the language of discernment, and so the person who steps back is marked, internally if not publicly, as deficient, disengaged, morally suspect. But what if ethics could accommodate breath? What if the act of returning was as important as the act of staying? What if witnessing was not a fixed posture but a rhythm, an oscillation between presence and retreat, each one informing the other? To carry responsibility without collapse requires more than will. It requires form, practice, frameworks that honour limitation not as failure but as part of moral maturity, among them bearing witness as an act, not a state, taking turns with care, building stamina not alone, but through ritual reflection and collective holding. This is not an invitation to apathy. It is an invitation to repair the straw of attention, to replace the fantasy of unbroken vigilance with something more human, more sustainable. Not every gaze must be permanent. Not every moment must be watched in real time. But some things eventually must be faced. And it is in the returning, not the constancy, where responsibility begins to breathe. There is a dignity in the act of turning back, not dramatic, not visible, a quiet motion, a re-entry into care after distance. It doesn't announce itself. It does not seek absolution. It arrives slowly, without ceremony, and yet it matters. The return is not a correction. It is not a reversal of harm. It is the recognition that attention, when chosen again, regains its weight. There is meaning in that choice, to come back, not because of pressure or guilt, but because something in the interior shifted, a thread pulled, a breath taken, a sense that the moment of rest has ended and something now asks to be seen. But this return cannot be everything. It cannot be to all things. No one can carry it all. The dignity lies in the specificity, in choosing what to face, not because it is most urgent, but because it is most enduring. The face that lingers, the story that remained, the image that never left, even when unlooked. To return is to accept a kind of incompleteness, that some harms will remain unheld, that some cries will not be heard. And yet in choosing one thing, one thread to follow, one silence to interrupt, a different kind of ethics emerges. Not comprehensive, not heroic, but rooted. The world does not need more eyes, it needs more presence, the kind that arrives slowly after quiet, the kind that stays not out of obligation, but because something in it still feels, and feeling chooses to witness again. Not all looking is equal. Not all returning carries the same weight. Some come back with armour, others bare, some out of reflex, others after deep pause. But what makes the act matter is not the gaze itself. It's the manner of its arrival, the presence it carries, the silence it interrupts. Witnessing cannot remain solitary. not indefinitely. If presence is to be sustained, it must be shared, distributed, supported by structures that do not rely on individual endurance alone. There must be rituals that hold the weight, communities that absorb the overflow, languages that can contain the unspeakable. This is not about grand assemblies. It is about the quiet systems that allow one to stay. A circle of care, a rhythm of rest, a culture that does not demand unbroken vigilance as proof of virtue. In such a structure, one does not witness endlessly. One takes turns, one steps forward, then back, and another steps forward. Together, the gaze holds. This collective model is not utopian. It is functional, necessary. Without it, even the most compassionate will fracture. Without it, the ethics of attention become self-consuming, a martyrdom loop that serves neither the seen nor the seer. To remain with suffering, not as spectacle, but as shared burden, requires form. The form is not fixed. It may be a song, a gesture, a vigil, a refusal to look away, not just with the eyes, but with time, with labour, with continued care. This is the infrastructure of witness, not an idea, a practice, not a moment, a rhythm. And in that rhythm, something steadier emerges, not the fragile gaze of the overwhelmed, but the grounded presence of those who have learned to witness together. There is a moment, barely perceptible, when the distance dissolves. Not entirely, not forever, but enough. Enough for the gaze to soften, for the breath to deepen, for the quiet re-entry into presence to begin. It does not start with a headline. It starts with a feeling. The return is not a performance. It does not seek validation. It does not explain itself. It is not the triumph of ethics, but the murmur of care. That quiet, enduring hum beneath exhaustion. What returns is not the self of before, but something tempered, worn perhaps, but ready, not for everything, just for something, and that something matters, because it is chosen, a particular face, a name, a cause, once tongues turned from that now calls again, not louder but differently. This is not obligation, this is love, the kind that lingers even when attention falters, the kind that survives pause, the kind that makes the act of looking possible again. To return is not to resolve. It is to re-enter, to begin again, not with clarity but with care, not with strength but with tenderness, not because it is demanded but because in the long quiet of distance, something still called back, and that call was heard. Nothing concludes here, the questions remain, not in need of answers but in need of staying. The gaze will turn again, fatigue will return, silence will press in, and still something endures. Not as command, not as doctrine, but as a soft insistence that some part of the self remains capable of looking, not endlessly, not at everything, but long enough to stay with one name, one loss, one moment not yet metabolized. Ethics does not require omnipresence. It requires return, the slow, incomplete rhythm of care that falters, stops, and begins again. Not because it must, but because something in the unseen still matters. And even when the gaze fails, even when it retreats again, the tension does not resolve, it deepens, it waits, it hums in the distance, the ache of something witnessed once and not forgotten. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.